Welcome back, students. We are talking today about Nemeth grouping indicators and their specific rules for use. This mini lesson is a supplement to what you're reading in your textbook and the practice activities you're doing both in practice and then in the class assignment to help you understand and conceptualize how grouping indicators work in the Nemeth code. So when we're talking about grouping indicators, we're talking about things like parentheses that hold things together. You already know some from UEB. You know the open and close quotation marks, the open and close single quotes, some open and close parentheses in the UEB context. Those are literary punctuation. They mean things in a sentence grammatically to connect one piece to another. They also mean things in UEB technical. Nemeth is its own code for math and science, and it writes these indicators its own way. These aren't shared symbols across the codes. So in order to use these symbols, we need to already be in Nemeth mode and have that open Nemeth indicator going on. Then when we want to write group signs like parentheses, they are based on the of and with shapes. So as a pair, you can see there, the of and with cell shapes are the parentheses. And you can see in my yellow bar at the bottom that's showing a translation that those are the open and close parentheses. These are kind of our base shapes and they help with all of the grouping symbols. We can modify those shapes with prefixes. If I put a .4 before it, I get a square bracket. I could then write some numbers and close my square bracket. So I'd close my square bracket with another .4 and then the closing shape. I could have other prefixes like a .46, which would give me a curly brace, often used sort of in matrices or in other kinds of set notation. And there's even one for angle braces that you might use in vectors in, say, physics or a further on math or science class of that sort. And that would have two .46 prefixes in front of each of them. So those are our open and closed shapes. And remember, those all occur within the Nemeth code. So we have to be in the Nemeth code context in order to write those at all. Otherwise, they just mean of, with, things like that. In Nemeth mode, grouping is really important. We group ordered pairs. That's probably the first thing that little kids will learn to group in mathematics, but we group other things too. We also use these as a shorthand way to multiply one set of things by another set of things when you put two sets of parentheses next to each other. And either way, the opening parentheses or opening grouping indicator based on parentheses or even based on absolute value sets numeric mode. So anytime that I open that parentheses, I turn on numeric mode. And that, of course, continues until either the end of the group, so when I close the parentheses, or until a symbol interrupts it that would terminate numeric mode, like a punctuation indicator or a grade 1 indicator or something else. This is really useful because then if I'm going to write ordered pairs, I could do it right inside my grouping indicator. I can go ahead and write the number 1 right away with a .2. Remember, our comma, mathematical comma, is different. It's a .6. And then we always put a space between terms, and we can write the other part of the ordered pair if it's spaced like that. So I could go ahead and write a set of ordered pairs, and you see that it's very efficient and it's very easy to find what's what in that pairing. So that's one example of the opening group sign, the opening grouping punctuation mark, the parentheses in this case, setting numeric mode. That means I don't have to use a numeric indicator right after it to make something a number. I could also use that when multiplying. I could multiply maybe 35x times y, right? And you can see that I can multiply that with the parentheses. I could even, if the second term also had parentheses, I could go ahead and put that around. I can do that without having to specify the numeric mode. That also means I don't need to specify grade 1 mode. I don't need to do the .5, 6 to indicate that y is a letter and Y is not the word U, because you remember, even from UEB, that anytime numeric mode is set, grade 1 mode is also set through the end of the word. So that takes care of that. When it's a letter that would terminate a number, it still just works as a letter. And now I've saved another indicator. So this opening parentheses, turning on numeric mode, very, very helpful for saving space and being efficient. There is another type of group indicator like that, other than parentheses, square brackets, and round brackets, and that is the vertical bar. Vertical bar is most commonly used for absolute values. So I would then, write whatever number I'm taking the absolute value of, and then close my absolute value with the same symbol. And if you look at my bottom yellow translation line there, you can see that's the absolute value of X. Pretty logical thing in algebra. There also exists a double bar version of that in math that if you were ever using is done just with a repeated indicator. Note that that's 2 vertical bars as the grouping symbol rather than a parallel mark, which can look the same in print but has a very different meaning. In Nemeth, our meaning follows the meaning of the math in our Braille transcription rather than the literal look of the symbol. So anytime we're opening one of those indicators, it sets numeric mode, meaning we don't need to use a numeric indicator to turn on numeric mode after it. So if I'm taking the absolute value of -4, I can simply take the absolute value of -4. I don't need a numeric indicator in front of my 4 to show that it's a 4 because I already am in numeric mode. Again, saving us a little bit of space, saving us a little bit of indicators, which is nice because we wasted space on those indicators turning Nemeth mode on in the first place, at least on just small, simple example problems. Certainly on actual math work, you're usually just in Nemeth mode for large sections of the page at a time, and it doesn't waste any space at all to turn them on and off. If you do need to turn off the numeric mode inside one of those, other indicators do that just fine. So if I were writing something that was in parentheses and then also was maybe, had some punctuation in it, maybe there was a quotation mark in there, I could turn off numeric mode by intentionally moving myself to punctuation mode with my 4, 5, 6 Nemeth punctuation indicator. And then I could go on and write my other non-numeric symbols after that without any problem. So know that that's an option. A punctuation indicator can be used to turn those off if you should need to. Grouping signs, and I'm just going to leave my Nemeth mode on for a section here, can generally be nested. That means that if you have something that opens, it needs to close again at the end. It can't just roll on forever. It has to close again. So if I were going to have a complicated math equation, I'm going to start mine with square brackets because in the era I learned math, square brackets outside of regular parentheses was pretty common. So I'm going to make 2x, and then I'll put a regular parentheses, and I'm going to put 3y there, and then I'm going to close my parentheses, and then I'm going to close my bracket. And so if you look at this example, you see that when I open my parentheses, I closed my parentheses, and from where I opened my bracket, I eventually closed my bracket. Generally speaking, the order of those is that whatever's on the inside has to close first before something bigger on the outside closed, before something bigger on the outside closed. They should all nest inside each other until you get down to the smallest layer. And that helps avoid confusion if instead that equation were written with all parentheses, right? So if I open 2x, and then I open 3y, and then I close, and then I close again, a mathematician would know that this first closing parentheses closes whatever was most recently opened, that parentheses 3y is a set, and we don't somehow have open parentheses 2x, open parentheses 3y, close parentheses, closing that first one, and the parentheses 3y scrolling on to see other things, because mathematically it doesn't make sense for things to cross over. So each one has to close outside of everything that's in it. And everything that's on the inside closes first. And then as you work your way out, they close in order. With that, it brings up one of my favorite soapboxes, which is kind of the subtle difference when we're transcribing things from print to Braille between typography or orthography, how something is written that means the same thing, versus decorative differences, which also mean the same thing, but are just there to be pretty. In UEB, you may have learned this about italics, that if the italics bears meaning, we transcribe it in Braille, and we have now an italic symbol and a bold symbol and an underline symbol to be able to convey those different typefaces that would tell the reader meaning. But if a book or a document is formatted and it uses one of those typefaces digitally just to be decorative, it doesn't convey any useful meaning, then we don't transcribe those into Braille. And this cuts down on distraction and wasted space and all that sort of stuff. So that still stands. If something is just decorative, if it's only there for decorative purposes, we don't put that in the Braille generally. But there are times in math where there are many variations in orthography for how you can write something that it could be written in print a lot of different ways, and we have those ways in Braille as well. But generally, the print might be interchangeable. For example, in these two sentences where I've got the same math problem written once with parentheses all the way through and once with actual square brackets. They mean the same thing. If you solve this math equation, either way it's written, you get the same answer. A mathematician would look at the two, and some mathematician may have the preference for changing between braces and brackets and parentheses for clarity all the way through their problem. Other mathematicians write all of them with parentheses because meaning-wise it's exactly the same. It doesn't have to change. It doesn't change the problem at all. And both mean the same thing in the end. So here's my stance and my advice to you as a TVI. If I am Brailling a document that's in print and putting it in Braille, and those differences in how something is written, whether it's a parentheses or a bracket, doesn't really change the meaning, I will still put the Braille, the different symbols that are used in print. That means if they Brailled it, or if they wrote it in print with some square braces, and some regular parentheses, when I make my Braille for the student, I'm going to put square braces where they put square braces, curly braces where they put curly braces, and parentheses where they put parentheses. This comes from a soapbox about literacy, which is that in order for my Braille reading student to learn to read the full set of the Nemeth code, they need to see that in use around them, right? So if the book, if the worksheet, whatever, has a square bracket on it, I'm going to Braille that with a square bracket so that my student has the opportunity to read and see that square bracket so they know that that's a symbol in Nemeth and they know how it can be used. I will always give my kids Braille that matches the print. Not when it's decorative, but when it's a valid variation in how you write something, I will write it the way the print wrote it. My student, however, does not need to meet that standard. If my student can say to me, yeah, but that's dumb. I've put an extra cell in here for a prefix that doesn't make a difference and it doesn't change the math. So while I'm working through the steps of solving the problem, I'm just using round parentheses for all of it. Totally fine. The student is entitled to write their Braille the way they want to write their Braille. And if it means the same as another valid, correct way to write the Braille, there are multiple choices, they can choose whatever one they want because that's literacy. It's literacy to get to write with your own preferred symbols. If you want to put multiplication as the multiplication cross or the asterisk or the single dot in the middle of a line, they all still mean multiplication. So I'm going to show my kids the full variety that their sighted classmates are seeing on their worksheets. But if my kid gives back to me every time the simple dot or the simple parentheses consistently, that's totally fine because yes, it saves space in Braille, so it's a bigger time savings than it would be for the visual clarity of, is it round or is it bracket? It's very easy for a Braille reader to understand nesting and feel like it's not confusing at all to write them all with parentheses, and that's okay. If my student can say to me, this is better, faster, easier for me, and that's the way I prefer to write it, as long as they're getting right answers, right, that they're not actually getting confused and doing the steps wrong when they write them all round parentheses, then that's fine. And it's a wonderful sign of literacy when your students can write things simpler and clearer than a textbook or teacher chose to. A-okay. But I always continue to write for my students the square brackets or the curly braces so that they don't get to the ACT and go, oh man, I know I saw this sign in the second grade, but I haven't used it since then because I convinced my TVI that I was just going to use round parentheses forever. And now I don't know what it is. We don't want to create situations where students don't recognize other styles of writing. So I always write it for my students the way the print is, but I totally let them write it their most comfortable, their most efficient way back to me and call all of that right. As long as the math is right, they're good. So there's my little soapbox on why I use more of these symbols as a teacher than I do as a scientist solving math problems. When I write for myself, I write it the simple way. When I write for my students, I write it the way the print showed. The key take-homes from this lesson: anything you open, you've got to close. And you're already pretty good at that because you've been opening Nemeth mode and closing Nemeth mode for a couple of weeks now. Same goes for our group signs. And these grouping indicators turn on numeric mode, so they save us the need for some other indicators like numeric indicators or grade 1 indicators for the first series of symbols that follow each of them. Take a look at your book this week. It will show you kind of the baby steps along that and what that can look like with each different sort of things you could enclose in parentheses, how that saves you space on kind of the letters that might be parts of a problem, as well as numbers. So read through that closely. Make sure you chime in and ask questions during office hours or on discussion boards if anything throws you for a loop. And I'll see you back next week. Happy Brailing!